So, if you ask almost anyone what killed the timber industry in the Pacific Northwest, they are going to give you the exact same answer.
Right, the northern spotted owl.
Exactly. Like, it's this narrative that is just carved in stone, you know? The bird gets listed as threatened in 1990, the federal injunctions come down, and then these logging towns just empty out.
Yeah, that is definitely the conventional wisdom.
But what if I told you that in one massive Washington forest, the most famous culprit in environmental history was actually completely innocent?
I mean, that's a huge claim.
It is. And the real weapon wasn't a bird at all. It was a multi-million-dollar gamble on just 4 inches of wood and, like, this absolute mountain of administrative paperwork.
Wow.
Yeah. So welcome to this deep dive into the true story of the Colville National Forest.
All right.
Okay, let's unpack this.
We really do need to unpack that because, looking at the dossier for this, the historical records, the trade press articles, newspaper archives, and even company statements from Vagan Brothers Lumber, it's fascinating.
It really is.
Because we're going to look at this totally impartially, synthesizing all this data to figure out why this historical shift actually happened.
Yeah.
And frankly, we need to separate the regional myths from the local realities.
Right, and to do that, we have to start by dismantling that massive assumption, which all comes down to a really basic map check.
Exactly. It's a geographic correction that changes everything. Because the Colville National Forest is huge, right?
Yeah.
It's 1.1 million acres. But it is located east of the Cascade crest.
East of the crest, which, why is that so important for people to understand?
Well, the Northwest Forest Plan, which was that massive federal framework created to protect the spotted owl's rainforest habitat, the plan covers 17 national forests and 1 scenic area.
Okay.
And if you look at the Forest Service's own fact sheet listing every single one of those forests, the Colville is emphatically not on that list.
Wait, really? It's just not there?
Not there. It's explicitly excluded.
So blaming the spotted owl for the Colville timber collapse is it's like blaming a hurricane in Florida for a drought in Nevada. I mean, they're completely different weather systems.
That's a really good analogy, yeah.
Because the Colville isn't a wet west side rainforest. It's dry, right? Full of ponderosa pine and larch.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, there was a regulatory overlay for the east side of the Cascades implemented in 1994 called the East Side Screens. And those barred logging trees, 21 inches or larger in diameter.
Oh, okay, so maybe that did it.
Well, you would think so, but the researchers who compiled our sources combed through the records, and they couldn't find a single document explicitly naming the Colville among the forests bound by those screens.
Seriously?
Yeah. I mean, we can infer it probably applied, but there is no smoking gun in the paperwork at all.
Which just leaves us with this massive mystery, because historically, the Colville yielded about 80 million board feet of timber every single year.
Right.
And actually, just really quickly, I should probably define board foot for anyone listening who isn't a lumberjack.
That's probably a good idea.
Yeah, so a board foot is just the standard unit of volume in the industry. It's a piece of wood that is 12 inches wide, 12 inches long, and 1 inch thick. So 80 million of those a year.
That's a massive amount of wood.
It is. So if the owl didn't suddenly shut down that economic engine, what actually did?
Well, people usually assume the federal government just caved to environmental pressure and stopped cutting. But in 1992, the Forest Service did the exact opposite.
What did they do?
They actually proposed raising the Colville harvest from that 80 million average all the way up to 123 million board feet a year.
Oh, wow. I have to imagine proposing a surge like that triggered just like an immediate backlash.
Oh, it did. On February 13th, 1992, a coalition of 7 conservation groups organized by a physician named John Osborne mobilized to block it.
Okay, and I'm guessing they sued.
They threatened to sue.
Yeah.
But that massive courtroom showdown, it never actually reached a court.
Wait, I'm confused. If they didn't get a judge to issue some massive court injunction, how do you stop a federal agency from doubling the logging?
This is where we get to the quiet weapon, administrative procedure. What's fascinating here is the sheer asymmetry of their tactic.
Okay.
Instead of litigating, they launched a volunteer campaign called Forest Watch, which was coordinated by a man named Barry Rosenberg. And they just trained ordinary citizens to read the dense timber sale documents and file administrative appeals on individual sales.
Wait, so they didn't get an injunction. They just essentially used the agency's own paperwork against them.
Exactly. And it was genius, really.
Yeah.
Because of the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, when the Forest Service plans a sale, they have to publish all these environmental analyses.
The really thick reports.
Yeah. And if a citizen files a formal appeal pointing out one specific flaw, like, say, a miscalculated erosion risk. The agency can't just ignore it. They legally have to halt the process, investigate the claim, and write a formal, scientifically sound response.
I see. So you don't need a lawyer to prove the whole system is broken. You just find one math error in one road plan, and that single sale just grinds to a halt.
Then you multiply that by dozens of volunteers looking at every single sale.
Yeah.
Every appeal costs federal staff time to answer. And the Colville just didn't have the budget. They had a $12 million annual budget, and less than $2 million of that was for timber management.
So they couldn't afford to fight a paper war.
Exactly. The program didn't end with a judge's gavel. It
Yeah.
collapsed under its own weight.
That is just wild. And, we should be totally transparent here. The sources actually disagree on the exact numbers of the resulting crash.
Yes, they do.
Depending on the metrics, the absolute bottom of the harvest, the trough, is listed variously as 15 million board feet, under 20 million, and then another source says about 40 million board feet.
Which is pretty widespread.
It is, but honestly, regardless of which exact number is right, we are still looking at roughly an 80% reduction within a single decade.
Right. And while the appeals were the catalyst, there were other weights on the scale, too.
Like what?
Well, you had the 2001 roadless rule, which locked up roughly 182,000 acres from road construction.
Okay.
You had the NEPA timelines themselves, stretching out to 5 to 7 years just to prep a sale. And there was a massive Canadian softwood dispute driving down lumber prices across the board.
Right, because of cheaper imported wood. But, when we talk about administrative bottlenecks and structural weights, it sounds so bloodless on paper.
It does.
And I really want to ground this because for the living people involved, this was devastating. So let's slow down and look at what that 80% drop actually felt like on the ground.
Yeah, we have to look at February 7th, 2003.
Which was a Friday.
Right. On that Friday, in Republic, Washington, Vagan Brothers Lumber permanently closed its mill.
And the raw human arithmetic of that is just stark. That was 87 jobs lost in Ferry County. 61 people lost their jobs immediately that morning, and then another 26 were let go a bit later.
And, to give that vital context, Ferry County is a county of only 7,300 people.
Wow.
And they were already sitting at a 14% unemployment rate.
That is heavy. Think about your own hometown for a second. What happens to the tax base, the schools, and the grocery stores when the central economic pillar just vanishes like that?
It fundamentally alters the community. And the most devastating statistic in our sources explains exactly why the mill had to close. That mill used to get 80% of its raw material from federal land.
Yeah.
By the end, the federal timber supply they could access equaled just 5 days of running per year.
Wait, 5 days a month?
No, 5 days a year.
Oh my God.
Yeah, the math just didn't work anymore.
Which leads to, honestly, the most amazing part of this whole dossier. Because with the federal timber supply practically gone, how did Vagan Brothers Lumber survive? Because they are still a major player today.
They are. And it wasn't because of some political victory. It was a massive high-stakes bet.
A bet on the pieces of wood that literally everyone else threw away.
Exactly. So, a bit of background on the company. Vagan Brothers Lumber was officially founded around 1952 by Bert and Bud Vagan.
Though looking at the records, the real prehistory of it traces back to their maternal grandfather, Volmer Anderson, who was running homestead mills back in the 1920s or 1930s. The sources kind of conflict on the exact decade there.
Right. But fast forward to Dwayne Vagan taking over, and he realizes they have to completely invert the math of the sawmill industry.
Because for, a century, inland sawmills only wanted massive logs, right?
Yes. The bigger the log, the more money you make for the same amount of handling time. Small logs were a disposal problem. They were just financial deadweight.
But Dwayne bets on the disposal logs. How do you even do that?
It started with a huge technological evolution. In 1978, they installed stress rating equipment.
And what does that do?
Well, previously, lumber was graded visually. A guy looks at a board, sees tiny knots and tight rings, and assumes it's weak. Small inland wood looks terrible visually.
Right.
But stress rating machines physically bend the wood to measure its stiffness. And it turned out, because those small trees grew slowly, their tight rings made them incredibly strong.
Oh, wow. So suddenly they can prove the wood is strong and charge a premium for it.
Exactly. But you still have to cut millions of tiny logs fast enough to make a profit. which brings us to the late 1980s.
And we should know our sources actually disagree here, too. Two newspapers say it was 1987, but the closest trade account says 1989, so late 1980s.
Right, in the late 1980s, they installed their first computer-guided Hugh saw.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting to me. Because it's like a gold mine realizing all the big nuggets are gone. So they invent this multi-million-dollar machine just to extract gold dust at light speed.
That's exactly what the Hugh saw is. Traditional saws take multiple passes. The log gets rolled, sliced, turned, sliced again. The Hugh saw is a single-pass machine.
Like an apple core.
Yes, the log shoots through, and the machine simultaneously chips away the rounded outside and saws the core into standard rectangular lumber in one motion.
And the constraint they built this whole thing around is so specific, they rebuilt their line to handle logs with tops that were roughly 4 to 4.5 inches.
Right.
Which I know Dwayne Vigurjan has unverified claims saying they took them down to 3 inches, but that actually contradicts the trade specs. So we're going with roughly 4 to 4.5 inches.
Yeah, we have to stick to the documented minimums. And to process wood that small, you can't rely on human reflexes.
Right.
By the 2000s, they had fin-scan cameras reading the boards for defects, XY scanners mapping the three-dimensional shape of every log in milliseconds, and computers shifting the saw blades before the log even arrived.
It's just wild. They turned a lumber mill into a data processing center. But this raises an important question, right? Because the technology saved the company, but it created this really fascinating unintended ecological irony.
It really is an incredible irony, because Vagan didn't retool due to some, ecological awakening.
Right. The stress rating went in during 1978. That was way before the spotted owl or the forest watch appeals.
It was a pure business calculation about scarcity. But by the time the timber wars ended, the forest was in crisis. Decades of fire suppression meant that Colville was choked with dense, small, highly flammable trees.
The forest desperately needed to be thinned out to stop megafires.
Yes. And Vagan had accidentally built exactly the machine the ecosystem required for restoration.
Because without a private mill willing to buy those tiny trees, the government could never afford to thin the forest on its own.
Exactly. The profit motive funded the ecological necessity.
But, we really shouldn't end this on just a perfectly happy corporate fairy tale, because while that counterbet absolutely worked for the company, we have to look at the workforce.
The sobering reality.
Yeah. In 1989, Vagan employed 495 people. By 2020, that number was about 260.
That is a massive drop.
It is, and just to note, there are no published figures available for 2021 through 2026, but the trend is clear. Making small logs profitable requires heavy automation, and automation just requires fewer hands.
It really highlights how survival in a changing world isn't always about winning a grand ideological battle in court.
No, sometimes it's literally just about navigating the quiet paperwork and doing the ruthless math to adapt to the scraps that are left behind.
And it leaves you with a final thought to mull over.
Yeah.
Today, vital ecological restoration in these forests relies almost entirely on the profit motive of a private company that figured out how to monetize 4-inch logs. What happens to the health of our public lands if that private business calculation ever changes again?
That is a very unsettling question to leave on. But that wraps up our analysis of the Colville and the 4-inch bet. Like and subscribe. It really helps the channel reach others.